In a development that underscores the deepening geopolitical fault lines in the Middle East, Iran's top political figure has publicly rejected any prospect of cooperation with the United States, citing Washington's steadfast support for Israel and its extended military footprint in the region. Meanwhile, US President Donald J. Trump, the 47th President of the United States, inaugurated on 20 January 2025, continues to tread carefully on the diplomacy versus force spectrum, even as allies call for more immediate action. At the same time, Israel's leader has sounded fresh warnings about Tehran's nuclear capacity, while the US military is redirecting forces away from the Middle East toward the Caribbean and Latin America, raising questions about strategic posture and regional vulnerability. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, spoke on 3 November 2025, delivering a pointed assessment of US policy in the Middle East. According to state media, he said the Americans sometimes say they would like to cooperate with Iran. Cooperation with Iran is not possible as long as the US continues to support the accursed Zionist regime, maintains military bases, and interferes in the region. He further specified the conditions under which Tehran would consider talking. If they were to completely abandon support for the Zionist regime, withdrew their military bases from here and refrained from interfering in the region, then it would be possible to examine the issue, but that is not for now, nor for the near future. These remarks signal that any meaningful engagement between Tehran and Washington remains blocked by fundamental policy divergences, not simply over nuclear issues, but over Israel, regional bases and interference in Middle East affairs. The position is consistent with previous statements from Khamenei that Iran will not be bullied into negotiations. From Tehran's perspective, the US remains the arrogant actor demanding submission rather than partnership. In his speech, Khamenei added that the arrogant nature of the United States accepts nothing other than submission. On the US side, President Trump has maintained a dual posture of openness to a deal with Iran while keeping pressure firmly in place. He is currently in his second non-consecutive term as President of the United States, having previously served as the 45th from 2017 to 2021, and now from the 20th of January 2025 onward. When pressed by reporters on whether he was convinced that Iran lacks nuclear capability, President Trump responded evasively, "Do you want to know? Do you want to know he was no nuclear capability?" Transcribed from the interview. The hedged phrasing reflects both caution and complexity. Washington continues to press Iran on its uranium enrichment, missile programs and regional proxies, but also signals willingness to negotiate under the right conditions. Analysts note that the hand of friendship and cooperation remains extended, albeit with major caveats. Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, has once again warned of Tehran's nuclear potential. In a recent speech, he stated, "We must not allow Iran to rebuild its military nuclear capacities. Iran's stockpiles of enriched uranium, these stockpiles must be eliminated." These remarks came amid fresh reports from Israel's intelligence community and international observers estimating that Iran might be capable of building as many as 9-10 nuclear bombs if it chose to weaponize itself. Stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Although Iran continues to claim its nuclear program is peaceful, the gap between enriched uranium thresholds and weaponization remains a major concern for Israel, the United States and other regional actors. That gap has only widened with recent attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities attributed to Israel and signals from Tehran that it will rebuild with greater strength. In a significant move that is raising eyebrows in Washington and the Gulf, the US has redirected its premier carrier strike group away from the Middle East and into the Caribbean, Latin America region. USS Gerald R. Ford, the Navy's newest and most capable aircraft carrier, has been ordered to Caribbean waters by US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Officials say the carrier is part of a broadened campaign against major drug trafficking networks and transnational criminal organizations in Latin America, rather than a Middle East deployment. Nevertheless, US Defense analysts caution that removing a major naval asset from the Middle East at a time of heightened Iran-Israel tensions may leave a strategic vacuum, one that Tehran or its proxies might feel encouraged to exploit. In particular, satellite imagery reviewed by centres such as Centre for Strategic and International Studies suggests potential Iranian steps at key enrichment or missile sites may go unmonitored. Taken together, what we have are three interlocking fault lines shaping the current dynamic. Iran versus US policy. Tehran refuses to engage, while Washington maintains bases and supports Israel. Israel's existential alarm. Jerusalem sees Iran's enrichment as a direct existential threat and is prepared to act unilaterally. US strategic posture shift. Washington appears to be reallocating naval resources away from the Persian Gulf region at a moment of high tension. These threads converge in the nuclear domain, where Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium, missile capabilities and regional proxy networks are increasingly central to any assessment of potential escalation. According to recent UN-linked estimates, Iran could build multiple bombs if it committed to weaponization. In rejecting US engagement, Ayatollah Khamenei signaled that Tehran deems Washington's policy as structurally hostile, not simply misguided. His demand for withdrawal of US bases and cessation of support to Israel goes far beyond typical nuclear negotiation frameworks, which tend to focus on enrichment ceilings, inspections and sanctions relief. Equally, the insistence that cooperation is not for now nor for the near future underscores Iran's calculation. Tehran is not inclined to make meaningful concessions without broader strategic shifts in the region. The literal criteria, exit of US bases, end of Israel support, are likely non-negotiable from Tehran's vantage. The Iranian president's public vow to rebuild nuclear facilities with greater strength illustrates that Tehran is preparing for long-term competition, not just short-term bargaining. For President Trump's administration, the challenge is formidable. On one hand, Washington wants to prevent Iranian nuclear weaponization and restrain its regional influence. On the other hand, its capacity to enforce outcomes is constrained by diplomacy, fatigue, Middle East complexity, and now a shifting naval emphasis. The US has three broad strategic options: intensify coercion, expand maximum pressure, tools, sanctions, cyber operations, or even threatened strikes. Offer a limited bargain. Seek interim deal, reducing enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief, while leaving other issues for later. Accept a stalemate. Treat Iran's status quo as manageable and focus elsewhere, for example, Latin America, Asia. To date, Trump appears to be attempting the second option, signaling openness to talks, but still pressing Iran hard. Yet Iran's public red lines remain unmoved. The shifting of the Gerald Ford to the Caribbean may thus reflect a US decision to diversify risk rather than double down in the Gulf. For Israel, the window to act is perceived to be narrowing. Prime Minister Netanyahu's repeated warnings that Iran is very short or about to build a nuclear weapon feed into Israeli operational logic. If diplomacy stalls, preemption becomes more likely. The potential for a military strike on Iranian nuclear or missile sites, either by Israel or in concert with the US, remains elevated. Nevertheless, any strike risks broad escalation, Iranian retaliation against Gulf shipping, US M10s, bases, Israeli installations, or even prompt mobilization of proxies, for example, in Iraq, Syria, or Lebanon. With Iran signaling a vow for greater strength, the calculus is shifting from deterrence to confrontation for the Gulf and Middle East. The absence of a clear US naval carrier in region might embolden Iranian maritime or missile proxy operations, particularly in the Strait of Hormuz or Red Sea. Gulf Arab allies will watch closely for non-proliferation regime. If Iran continues enrichment and perceives a lower risk of US-Israeli intervention due to less naval presence, the credibility of nuclear restraint regimes is challenged. For US global posture, the pivot of assets to Latin America underscores a broader strategic rebalancing, but could undermine deterrence in the Middle East. for Israel-Iran relations. The tempo of Israeli warnings suggests a sense of urgency. If diplomacy fails by spring 2026, Israel may feel compelled to act. For global diplomacy, European intermediaries Britain, France, Germany remain engaged, but with limited leverage. Unless Tehran shifts its demands, Western diplomacy may stall. Key variables to monitor in the coming months include whether Iran accelerates uranium enrichment beyond declared ceilings or expands covert facilities, whether the US reverses its carrier redeployment or signals continued commitment in the Gulf, whether Israel commits to or signals imminent military action against Iranian nuclear sites, whether indirect US-Iran talks resume via third-party mediators, and whether they expand to include missile and proxy issues, whether Tehran adapts its public red lines, that is to say, begins to engage with Washington conditional on other actors, moderating, for example, Israel, rather than insisting on total US withdrawal. The announcement from Iran's supreme leader that cooperation with the United States is currently impossible sets a clear tone. Tehran views Washington not merely as a negotiator, but as an adversary whose regional footprint must first be addressed. At the same time, President Trump's administration continues to signal openness to diplomacy, but is redirecting major military assets away from the Middle East. Israel, meanwhile, remains on high alert, warning of Iran's proximate nuclear weapon potential and preparing for worst-case scenarios. As the strategic pieces shift, the cumulative risk of miscalculation is rising. Whether through escalation in missile or uranium enrichment terms, naval posturing changes or Israeli preventive strikes, the possibility of a new major flashpoint in the Middle East cannot be dismissed. The interplay of Israeli red lines, Iranian intransigence, and US strategic rebalancing will define the next chapter in a region already beset by volatility.